This is Interpreting Wine host and founder Lawrence Francis, welcoming you to this, my Willamette Valley Winemaker Special. Across these 20 episodes recorded in quickfire fashion in January 2020, I got to meet a broad selection of people making wine in the region, both a variety of winemaking scale from the micro to the macro, and also different focuses that include different aging vessels, different grape varieties, sparkling wines, and of course different interpretations of Pinot. Episodes are going to be released in the order that they were recorded, so you'll get to be a virtual guest on the tour. 2 things you can do to help spread this series even further. One is to subscribe to the podcast if you haven't already, either where you're listening or on your favorite podcast platform. And the second, the one that's really going to help push this out there, is to head to interpretingwine.com/iTunes and leave a review letting me know what you think. A genuine, huge thank you in advance. Today's episode of the Willamette Valley Winemaker Special features Maggie Harrison of Antica Terra. A hugely eloquent and honest speaker, Maggie tells us her origin story and philosophy in life and winemaking. She takes us on a virtual tour of the Antica Terra vineyard, weaving in her notes on typicity and winemaking in Oregon, before closing with a big question on communication and integrity. Enjoy.
I'm not a very good strategist. I know I'm not supposed to say that because I'm running a business and my job all day long every day is to chart course for this little winery, but it's just not what I'm made of, right? The reason that my first job in wine even turned out well at all is because it just happened to be a pretty good match of the character and the culture in that winery and how I was born, right? And I keep my head down, right? There's never, even when I was little and you asked me what I wanted to be, I didn't have an idea, right? All I know how to do is have a nice time today. I keep my head down and do the work that's in front of me. And doing that work has just leaded from one place to another without my ever saying, I'm going to do this now because what I want to be in 12 years is a master of wine. And so if I take this job, then I can study that. And if I learn all the numbers, then I can recite them. And if I get myself a pince nez, I can put it on my nose, right? I never knew I was going to work in wine. I didn't know I wanted to be a winemaker. There's no winemaking in my family, right? I was working in restaurants and I got interested in wine, and I got interested in wine because then I could make more money, and I love money. And so, right, the more I learned about wine, the bigger tips I could make. And the faster I got tips, the faster I could get on a plane because I wanted to travel the next day. And so then I started traveling, and each year after I traveled, I would come back and work in restaurants just so I could, make tips and stuff my pockets filled with money, stuff my pockets with money. And when I finally got old enough that I had to ask myself, well, what is it you're actually going to do? The only thing that was in front of me, aside from a degree in conflict resolution that I clearly wasn't using anywhere in my life, was that I'd kind of gotten into wine. And so, it could have been in Corsica just as easily. It was California. I just set about trying to find anyone that would let me in the door. And once they let me in the door, I just kept my head down. And so it's the same way we make wine here. I do exactly what I'm doing for as long as it serves me, and I allow that thing to lead me to the next thing. And I've never once looked at an opportunity and said, oh, that sounds like a really good idea, right? I'm in some ways the most fearful and terrified of change, right? I would have stayed any place I was planted for the whole of my life unless somebody shoved me towards what came next. It's sort of like being on a roller coaster with your eyes closed, right? Like I never know where I'm headed because I don't ever look up. And so every change actually seems kind of terrifying. But you get closer and closer to the edge, and you get sucked closer and closer to the rapids, and then you get drawn into what comes next, and then you just start paddling. And so I really ended up here after being tricked into take a look at the Antica Terra vineyard. I fell in love with that vineyard, but that was only after I had been lucky enough to land a job with no experience at a winery in California. And that was only because I worked in a restaurant that I was lucky enough to have because I just wanted to make some money to travel. And so, if you found me in the middle of university or the middle of my college years and said, what do you think you're going to do one day? None of this was in the picture. In fact, there was nothing in the picture because I didn't have a good idea of where I should head to begin with. And so all I ever really do is, say what's the nicest step I should do next and take that tiny step without knowing where actually I'm supposed to end up.
Yeah, amazing. Okay.
Do you wish that I answered in actually more in a more narrative form so that anyone knew that what I was talking about? I got to Oregon because I was working in a winery in California, and the guys that are now my partners in Antica Terra were buying the vineyard. They wanted my old boss and mentor to be the winemaker, and when he said no, I was the next best choice. And they happened to have found a vineyard that it was impossible to say no to. It's a little Charlie Brown Christmas tree of a misfit of a vineyard, and that felt like a pretty good match for me.
Yeah, I mean, as we've kind of been discussing, there are lots of versions of your origin story out there in the world, and I'm very much. When I have these types of conversations, I like to just try to capture a sense of the moment, and I think we will talk to where we're sat now at a certain point, because we've just enjoyed some time here in your cellar room. But one of the things that I think you've really given a strong link to there is to actually talk about that land. And unfortunately on this visit I won't get the chance to see it with my own eyes, and actually I like that fact then that this episode can give me that kind of virtual tour. And then, of course, because we're recording what we're saying, it will also give the listener that kind of virtual tour. So in whatever way makes sense for you, today, give us that sense of where you're talking about there. Where is the fruit coming from that goes into these wines?
Well, first of all, that I'll take this microphone and walk you to the vineyard right now. So don't pretend I said no to you, because we just talked about the fact that I'll go further. But the vineyard, which we're not going to see because you're on a very tight schedule, but anytime you want to, it's a little bit of a geological anomaly, right? The whole of the state of Oregon was under the Pacific Ocean 40 million years ago. And so no matter where you're standing in the state, if you dig deeply enough, you will get down to essentially prehistoric seabed. It is the seabed from when the whole state of Oregon was under the Pacific Ocean. And that seabed is now very, 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 very compressed marine material. And if you crack open that rock, it's all sown with bright white marine fossils. It's all bright white clams and oysters that are 40 million years old. And so it is not at all unique to my site, because it is underlying every single square inch of the state of Oregon. It's just that the way things evolve geologically, that parent rock is in diagonal stripes down through the soil. And so even in the Yola Amity Hills, where typically you would need, where there are sort of typically the shallowest of soils of the Willamette Valley as sub-AVAs, you would typically need to dig about 35 to 85 inches to get down to that parent rock. If you look at something like the Dundee Hills, it's something like 80 to 120 inches. At my house in Portland, more like 300 inches. But wherever you are, if you dig deeply enough, you'll get down to this solid sheet of rock. It's just that the way this little south-facing bench on the back side of the Amity Hills was formed, there is no younger geological material on top of it. And so we are 0 to 16 inches of any soil on top of this solid sheet of unfriable rock. And so, look, while it's really beautiful, I'll show it to you, right? So that rock right there, that is my vineyard. And it's really sexy to talk about fossils, right? I mean, you can't go to a vineyard that has silex in it and not see silex rocks all around the winery. But this doesn't mean anything qualitatively, right? There's nothing better about growing vines on top of fossils than there is on deep jory soils or fertile marine sedimentary soils. It just is of this place. And so what's happened is that essentially and I'm making this word up, I know, but essentially the vines are bonsified, right? The whole vineyard is stunted. And so even the vines that were planted 30 years ago, I can still put my thumb and forefinger around the trunk of every single one. And the leaves are about half the size of a normal Pinot Noir leaf, and the clusters are about half or to a little about 40% as big as normal Pinot Noir clusters at harvest. And that's because, right, if you make a bonsai out of a grapevine, which one can do, and you should look it up on the internet because it is the cutest thing, it will make clusters that are about, this big, about 1 inch long, right? All the berries are teeny tiny, and it makes these little tiny clusters. And it's because for any bonsai, right, if the plant can't expand its root mass underground, so it won't allow the plant to expand above ground. And so the whole vineyard is essentially miniaturized. And so we know that the wines don't taste the way they do because they are carrying up really the characteristic of that rock. What they're carrying in a more pronounced way is just their miniaturization, right? It doesn't matter how I want to make wines. I could say I want to make wines that are pale, fair, ethereal, right? Just right, like lovely, lilting, easy wines. That site will never make a wine that's easy, right? It breeds intensity because everything, all of the life of this plant is compacted into tiny spaces, right? And so right, it makes these wines of this intense seriousness, which suits me, right? Like I take everything pretty seriously. I think I'm fun to be around sometimes, but nothing's really easy for me. I take it all really seriously. And so this place with these, stunted vines creates wines that are hard to talk about. If you're talking to MWs or you're talking to MSs or somebody that's trying to gain a pin, so much of that work is about typicity, right? And yet from this site, the wines don't always taste like the Eola Amity Hills, and they don't always taste like Oregon. And for that matter, they don't always feel like Pinot Noir. They have this sort of non-fruit intensity and this intense sort of chisel and cut of architecture and Barolo-like tannins that don't feel really of this place at all. It's just that the place itself, that Antica Terra vineyard, is young enough that, its own typicity is not known in the greater world of wine. And so it is typical of exactly only that place. And so it's a hard place to farm, right? So many of the things that we all know are the most exciting things to talk about and the ways to farm, there is no water holding capacity at that site. It is planted on a solid sheet of rock. The vines are consistently, right, like hands on their jugulars with stress because, there is no soil. There's nothing forgiving about the site itself. And so we worry about it all the time. And I wring my hands into bone meal trying to figure out what are the movements that we can make in the vineyard to bring greater enlivenment. But what that requires of us, right? It's sort of like having a colicky child, or right, like any child that is hard to raise, is that you have to be there all the time, and right, you have to pay attention. And even when the attention is because you are trying to solve for problems over and over again, presence matter and paying attention matters. And when I stay up at night and I think about, right, and I worry and stress about how we're going to take care of that little place, those moments awake are reflected in the wine. Our being on the ground, worrying about what to do about this vine and that one, and treating each vine like a puzzle, those things are palpable in the resultant wine because it is a constant conversation between the people in this building and that place in trying to find its sort of greatest point and solution for care.
The story that you've told there and the way that you've told it is really, engaged me, made me want to obviously go and visit at a later point because, I do want to, of course, spend the time here with you and talk as we are. But I just love that term bonsified. And I just think that's brilliant. And I really just, do respect your honesty really in the way that you've spoken there because, it really, it feels like, there's such a personal, endeavor kind of comes to mind. But that kind of presence matters, being there, not wanting to, kind of telephone it in and, send in the kind of, pick at this bricks or pick at this moment or that moment. I genuinely think it really matters. And I'm, again, just happy to be able to share that element of your work and your craft with my listeners and people all around the world who, may never have the chance to meet you. It's really, humbling to be able to do that. That being said, we've got some of your wines sitting here on the table alongside us. So, I would just really, invite you to then, I guess, move forward with the story. Your personal story, the story of where you're making and growing the grapes through to now the wines as they've kind of come through the process. So again, I guess introduce us to these wines again, and whatever makes sense for you.
That's a pretty wide open question, Lawrence. The whole of my wines, but we spoke a little bit about that Antikythera. Antikythera is the only wine that we make that is entirely from our own little oddball vineyard, and so it takes on that personality of that place. Born on the fossils, right? That wine's about precision. It's about finding that exact characteristic and that voice that comes from that place and finding the percentage of any or all of the barrels from that site that make the most complete whole. The reality of that wine and all of the wines is that I don't give myself production goals. And so it is always possible that when we get to the blending table, I won't find that any barrels from the Antica Terra vineyard come together or find a harmony together in a way that I feel like I want to send it out into the world. If I make 1,000 cases of Antikythera this year, there could be 110 cases next year. When we get to the table with the wines, first of all, we blend everything blind. And so what that means is that we take a sample from every single barrel of Pinot Noir in the cellar, put them in numbered sample bottles, and then put them on the table in front of us. And we just work over the course of about 10 days. We do it in 3-day blocks for 8 to 11 hours a day and just put things together and take them apart and put them together and take them apart in every different way we can think of, like little meth addicts, over and over. And that's what they do. If they steal your lawnmower, you'll know, because they just take it apart and leave it on your lawn over and over and over and over again until we find the place where the wines rise. And so what we don't do at that table is say, okay, well, I need to find 500 cases of Antikythera, or I need this Botanica to look like what Botanica was last year. We had this conversation in my second year of making wine in Oregon. We made our first wine in 2005, and then we declassified the entire vintage. So there is no 2005 out in the world. 2006, we made our first wine. And, there's a huge amount of vintage variation in Oregon. So 2006 was this very opulent vintage, right? It was warm and dry. It was easy. Coming from California, nothing forced our hand. I got to go out and pick things as they ripened. It was warm. The wines were sort of rich and deep. And then in 2007, I was just talking about this morning, it rained through harvest, right? There were very few dry days. And so I made the 2007, and sometime later, 6 months later, I sent the wine out to my partners so they could taste it. And they called me and said, "What are we going to do?" And I said, "Oh my, you don't like it?" And they said, "No, it's excellent. It's nothing like last year's wine." And I said, "Well, right." Because it rained, and last year the sun was shining. And they said, "Well, you can't run a business that way. You can't, that's not a business, right? When your customers, right, your clients, wine drinkers in the world have to know if they pick up a bottle of Botanica, it will taste exactly like the Botanica that came before." And while I understand that from a business point of view, the things that you see it all over the valley, right? In colder years, right, it's legal to chaptalize here. So in colder years, you see people chaptalizing to get things up at 13.1% alcohol. And in warmer years, people out, right, with their refractometers, making sure they capture it at exactly 13.1 potential alcohol. And it drives people mad trying to force things into uniformity. But I love it. I mean, I think what an absolute treasure to be able to work in one single region where you get to work across the entire range of sort of that atlas of expression of Pinot Noir, because Pinot Noir is so different than, say, Cabernet or Syrah. I make both Cabernet and Syrah as well, or have made Cabernet and currently make Syrah. And if you're making Syrah, right, what is at the top of that pyramid is pretty narrow. You're either trying to make Chave or you're trying to make Allemand, or you're trying, right, like the sort of the highest levels are pretty close together. Same in Cabernet. But when you're working with Pinot Noir, it can go from pale, fair, ethereal, really, or to just drenched, sappy, dripping, muscular, and 16 different versions in between. And they're all equally delicious, right? There is no sort of highest possible answer. And so by working in Oregon, you get the opportunity to sort of work across that entire range of expression, just standing in one place. And so, I learned in year 2 that the wines I make today are not going to taste like the wines that I made yesterday, right? And the things that you would have to do to make a 12 taste like an 11, to make a 7 taste like a 6, to make a 2019 taste like an 18, they're not the nicest ways to make wine, right? That sort of push and that sort of intellectual exercise in creating a design and then making things to fit the form isn't of interest to me. And so what we set out to do really early on is to say, okay, well, since nobody knows how much of each wine they're going to get, if the wines even exist, and what exactly they're going to taste like, then what we have to be is a winery where the through thread is one of integrity and of intention, right? So that if you pick up a bottle of Antica Terra, it's not that you know that Botanica tastes just like the one you have in your cellar. It's that it was the most beautiful possibility from those fields in that year, in this building, in my hands. And that's what's been allowed to get into bottle. Because those are the things that endure, right? That is sort of the essence of emotional transparency. And that is, right, as everyone walks around and throws around a sense of place and terroir, right, you're not honoring this place if you negate the consequences of the weather, whether it's sunny or rainy. And you're not honoring this place if you're forcing things to some sort of central location or a central sort of, experience. But here, if we allow things to unfurl towards the edges, right, and we just trust that if we're always paring away everything that's imperfect, you will get to the most beautiful version that was possible, no matter what sort of DNA came with it. Because really our only job is to teach it how to sing, right? All of these wines in each vintage, they were brought to us with their own voice. I mean, they are a product of that season in that soil. All we can really do is to teach them how to sing.
Beautiful description, and I think, you've for me, you've really, I think, captured the essence of the wine here, and I think we don't need to sit down and go through a list of descriptors and try to kind of replicate this experience. I think this is more meaningful because you're actually talking about the values that you put into this, and the word I've written down here is integrity, and I guess really potentially for this wine or potentially for any of the others. I mean, the question I have and the kind of curiosity I have is really around how you communicate that, because a label says so much, a website says so much, a podcast can hopefully say a bit more. I'm just curious then, what does that then look like? How do you communicate that? And is it then that, we're then into presence matters post-bottling just as much? It's your presence then going right the way through the process, having been out in the field, having been in the cellar, and now we're talking about your presence being there, opening these bottles and then communicating that integrity to wherever your customers are and the ones that want to access it because they respect you and they respect the wines and they respect the integrity.
You ask really big questions. I mean, I think that the integrity, right, comes from the work. It is staying close to the work all the time. And so the way that I learned how to make wine is the way that I now run a business. And the way that I learned how to make wine is you just look at exactly what's in front of you in every single moment, no matter what you're doing. And you say, what's the most beautiful thing I can do right now? And then, and this is the big difference, right? You do it with fairly maniacal rigor before you move on to the next thing. And I say that, right, with that weird pregnant pause I just made, because that's the hard part, right? Everyone can talk, right? Everyone can say all the things they do, but ultimately, once you've decided what is the most beautiful thing you can do, it is almost without fail going to be the most difficult, the most expensive, the most inconvenient, the most tiring, the one that's going to keep you up for 6 24-hour days in a row during harvest. And so it's really easy to compromise, right? There is infinite temptation to compromise. And the reality is there's a ton of room for it, right? Winemaking allows for a lot of cut corners. But I think the wines with which we fall in love are the ones where there is a certain allergy to compromise, that there is a feeling of a human being with a beating heart staying close to that work and making real decisions about those wines. And it's why I think it's such folly for us to get tripped up on any particular practice, or right, like sulfur, no sulfur, or, you know, non-inoculated fermentation or inoculated fermentations, or a whole cluster, or new oak, right? It has so much less to do with any of those things than just actually that thing, that choice of work really means something to the person doing the work, right? So, you know, my best friend makes wine, and we make wine incredibly differently, right? He uses commercial yeast. I don't inoculate with commercial yeast. And yet the wines, I think, resonate with the same level of energy and of intention, because they are a clear sightline through to my heart and his to his, right? They resonate with the energy of that human. And so I think it goes all through the process, right? You can't just say, I'm going to do the highest possible thing when it comes to calling the pick for this fruit, but then when you welcome a guest into your winery, you're a jerk to them, right? And you can't say it's going to be the highest possible answer, but I'm going to hire some, you know, regional, national sales director, ambassador to go take my appointments for me. If somebody's going to understand this work and these wines are going to have a life outside these doors, then I better walk them out the door. And I better get on the planes, and I better sit across from you, and I better sit with the sommeliers, and I better meet my mailing list customers and my clients and the drinkers of my wine wherever they are, because ultimately the intimacy that we have in our work, that staying close and keeping your head down and presence matters. Right? All of that is garbage if I throw it away the minute the wine leaves the building, right? If the truck backs up to the door and the wine goes out in the world and I'm not willing to meet it there, then none of the work that we did on this side makes any difference. And so that integrity, right? I sound like a political candidate, but right, right, like integrity equals intimacy equals work. And that's all we really have. I mean, you walked into the building. We don't have any tanks. We don't have it, right? There is no stuff there. We don't have any infrastructure. All we really have is a little scrappy collection of human beings who want to do good work in the world and who are willing to throw down for it. And so nobody can feel that. Hopefully everyone can feel it in the glass, but it has to be constant in every interaction everywhere.
Thank you so much, Maggie. I really feel like that episode, like your wines, really captured a sense of our conversation and time together on the day. I'd also like to say a huge thank you to Chef Timothy Westell and team at Antica Terra for making my time there really enjoyable. Please do see below for the Antica Terra website for details of the wines and also the events that they regularly host in Portland and at their tasting room. Next time on the podcast, in episode 389, Maggie passes the baton to Brianne Day, winemaker at Day Wines. And if you're loving the series so far, do please let me know on social media, where I'm at Interpreting Wine on Instagram and Facebook, at Wine Podcast on Twitter, and email hello@interpretingwine.com. See you next time.